Good morning. This is your last lesson for the week. So you made it this far. That's it for this week. Tomorrow there are no classes. Monday there'll be tests, but you don't have to worry about that for another while. Don't worry, there'll be reviews up for you guys as well, so you can study for the test on Monday. But for now, let's jump right into our lesson 85. It is on page 409, and so we'll just get started. When performing operations with fractions and decimals, in the same problem, we will rewrite the problem so that all numbers are written in the same form, either as fractions or as decimals. So when we're adding or subtracting decimals together or multiplying decimals and fractions, we need to make sure that either the entire problem is set up as a decimal plus a decimal or minus a decimal, or a fraction plus or minus a fraction. Okay, so here we've got a couple of examples. Make sure you're following along in your books on page 410, example number 1. We're going to add 0.5 and 1/4. So write the answer as a fraction and as a decimal. So first we're going to show it in fraction form. As a fraction, 0.5 is converted to 5/10. Now, if you're a little confused as to how you got 5/10 from that decimal, the 5 is in the tenths place. Okay, so the 10 determines the place of the decimal determines its denominator. So if it's in the tenths place, that's the denominator of 10. If it's in the hundredth place, it's a denominator of 100. If it's in the thousandths place, a denominator of 1,000, and so on. That's how you determine the denominator of the decimal. Okay. So in this case, we had, I should write it down here. We had 0.5. 0.5, 5 is in the tens place, so that tells me my denominator. So now I've got 5/10. And just like any other fraction, I'm going to reduce it. So 5 goes into 10 2 times, so my fraction reduces down to 1 and 1/2. I'm sorry, 1.5. 1/2, yeah. And 1/2 plus 1/4. So now we're combining two fractions, okay? That's the whole point of this lesson. The point of this lesson is converting either the decimal into a fraction or the fraction to a decimal to combine it. Okay, so we've converted our decimal into a fraction. 0.5 equals 1/2 or 1/2, and now we can add 1/2 plus 1/4. And just like in any other fraction problem, we need to make sure that they have a common denominator. The way we find the common denominator is by finding the least common multiple of the denominators. Okay, so our denominators are 2 and 4. The least common multiple between 2 and 4 is 4. Okay, so my 1/4 can just transfer over here. I always like doing this just so you can see how that happens. So I just multiply 1/1. So 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 4 is 4. Then I take 2/2 because I'm trying to make my denominator for 1/2 a 4. Okay, so I need to multiply that 2 by another 2. And whatever I do to the denominator, I need to do to the numerator. I know if you guys have been watching the videos every day, I repeat this same problem over and over again, but I really want you guys to get it. All right, so we got 2/4. Now we can add these fractions together. Again, when adding fractions, we only add or subtract the numerator. The denominator remains the same. Okay, so 2 plus 1 is 3. My denominator stays the same, 4. So my final answer would be 3/4. Okay, now we've got the same problem, 0.5 plus 4, but now we're going to change the fraction into a decimal. In this one, we changed the decimal into a fraction. Here, we're going to change the fraction 1/4 into a decimal. How did I do that? My denominator becomes my divisor. My numerator becomes my dividend. And as you can see, I added place value so I can divide. I look here. 4 does not go into 1, so I place a 0. I place my decimal. I make sure my decimal is lined up with in the quotient. And then I add a 0. How many times does 4 go into 10? 2 times, so 4 times 2 is 8. Then I subtract it. 10 minus 8 is 2. Add a 0, bring it down. How many times does 4 go into 20? Goes into it 5 times evenly. 4 times 5 is 20. So we subtract it. 20 minus 20 is 0. So I've converted 1/4, the fraction 1/4, into the decimal number 0.25. And now I can combine 0.5 plus 0.25. Okay, as you can see, my 0.5, I added a 0 here. That doesn't change the value. It holds the place value in the hundredths place because I've got a decimal here that goes to the hundredths place. So in order to add or subtract it, I'm gonna add my 0, okay? Put my little addition sign. And now I add those. 0 plus 5 is 5, 5 plus 2 is 7. Our decimals, we make sure we're lining up our decimals. Decimals lined up in the sum, and there's no value in the ones place, so we write our 0, okay? Fairly simple lesson. You guys probably got this right off the bat, but again, if you didn't, don't hesitate to give me a call or shoot me a text or leave a comment on the video, all right? Let's go ahead and go into problem number, we have another example. This is for multiplication. Example number 3. So we did example number 2. We've got example number 3. We've got 1/3 times 0.3, okay? We've got a fraction, and we're multiplying it by a decimal. In this case, we are asked to show the answer in fraction form. So our decimal is going to be converted into a fraction. So same thing like we did over here. We have the 0.5. In this case, we have the 0.3. Okay, the 3 is in the tens place, so that tells me what the denominator is going to be. It's going to be 10. So 1/3 times 3 over 10. I could just multiply these like this, but I am going to cancel these out because 3 goes into 3 one time evenly. So now I've got my answer. 1 times 1 is 1, and 1 times 10 is 10. Okay, and I've answered the final question with a fraction. Okay, and I feel like I just confused myself here. I'm kind of going backwards. I'm sorry. If you're following along, I apologize. Let's jump back to example number 2. I want to make sure we cover all our bases. So example number 2 now. We've got 1/2 plus 0.3, and we need to show the answer as a decimal. Okay, so in order to show my answer as the decimal, I need to change my fraction into a decimal. So we did the same thing we did up here. My denominator becomes my divisor. My numerator becomes my dividend. And I see how many times 2 goes into 1. And it does not, so I write a 0. I line up my decimals and I add a 0. How many times does 2 go into 10? It goes into it 5 times evenly. So 2 times 5 is 10. Subtract it, 10 minus 10 is 0. So I've converted 1/2 into a decimal. So I've got 0.5. And now I can add these two. 0.5, which represents the 1/2, plus 0.3 is 0.8. So I've answered this question. What is 1/2 plus 1/3? In decimal form is 0.8. All right, let's go on. We can go ahead and jump into the problems. Problem number 1. What is the quotient when the decimal number 10 and 6/10 is divided by 4/100ths, okay? So again, that is what is the quotient when the decimal number 10 and 6/10 is divided by 4/100ths. So our decimal numbers 10 and 6/10, okay? We know the 6 is here in the tens place from the information. And then 0.4 represents a decimal in the in the hundredths place, okay? You see tens, hundredths, okay? There's a 4 in the hundredths place. So now we're dividing. So I've got 0.04, okay, as my divisor, and 10.6 as my dividend, all right? Now, remember, our divisor can't be a decimal number, so we need to convert our divisor into a whole number. How do we do that? Well, we need to move our decimal over 2 places. And if you remember from the previous lesson, in order to do that, we need to multiply it by 100, or by the number of spaces it needs to move. If it just needed to move 1 space over to the right, we would multiply it by 10. It needs to move over 2 places, so we're going to multiply it by 100. Whatever we do to the divisor, we're also going to do to the dividend, okay? We're going to multiply it by 100. Multiplying it by 100 shifts the decimal place over 2 places, and the same here, okay? And that's represented here. So now I've got a whole number 4 and the number 1060. And now I can divide it. So first I see how many times does 4 go into 1? It doesn't. How many times does 4 go into 10? 2 times. 2 times 4 is 8. So I subtract it. 10 minus 8 is 2. Bring down the 6. Now how many times does 4 go into 26 evenly? It goes into it 4 times. So 4 times 4. Oops, I totally did that wrong. 6 times, I'm sorry, evenly. 6 times 4 is 24, and so I've got my 24 subtracted. 26 minus 24 is 2, bring down the 0, and now I've got 5 minus 4 equals 20, and I've got a 0, so no remainder. So my final answer would be 265. For answer number 1 is 265. All right, let's go on to problem number 3. Geraldine paid $10 for 1 dozen photographs costing 75 cents each. How much should she get back in change? Okay, so if she bought 10 photographs, a dozen photographs, we know there's 12 in a dozen. So I'm gonna multiply 0.5, which is what she paid, times 12. It's not what she paid. It's the cost of each photograph, times 12. So I went ahead and did that. When multiplying with decimals, remember, it's important that the numbers are lined up. In this case, there's no decimal for the whole number, okay? So we don't need to line that up. We need to line up the digits when multiplying decimals, okay? So set it up like a basic multiplication problem, 0.5 times 12. So I go 2 times 5 is 10. So I write my 0, raise the 1. 2 times 7 is 14 plus 1 is 50. So I write my 5 and raise 1. 2 times 0 is 0 plus 1, so I write my 1. Then I write a 0, okay, when I'm doing my next round of multiplying. I write a 0 in the 1's place, and then I go again. 1 times 5 is 5, 1 times 7 is 7, 1 times 0 is 0. And I didn't write that 0 down, but you can if you want to, but it's holding no place value. All right, now we can add it. 0 plus 0 is 0, 5 plus 5 is 10, raise the 1. Now we got 7 plus 1 plus 1 is 9, okay? So the cost of a dozen photographs of 75 cents each is $9. If she paid $10, you guys know this, 10 minus 9 might be a little hard for you to solve, so I'll solve it for you, is 1, all right? So she should get $1 back. All right, let's go on to problem number 5. How many cubes were used to build this rectangular prism? This rectangular prism is in your books, so look at it, but I've got some information here. I've counted 4 per row, so there's 4 cubes per row, and there are 4 rows. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna multiply these. 4 times 4 is 16. So my information tells me that there are 16 cubes were used to stack that rectangular prism. All right, so 16 for number 5. Make sure you show your work. All right, number 7. We've got 3 fifths minus 0.5, but we need to solve it as a fraction. So here we go. 3 fifths minus 0.4. We're converting our decimal 0.4 into a fraction, and I wrote it down here. So I've got 3 fifths. I like stacking up the fractions, and you see why. This is why I like stacking up the fractions and not doing it sideways. I've got 3 fifths, that stays the same. But my 0.4, the decimal 0.4, is gonna be converted into the fraction 4 over 10. Remember, the place value of the decimal determines the denominator. If it's in the tens place, the denominator of 10 is 10. If it were in the hundredths place, the denominator would be 100, okay? But in this case, it's in the tens place, so my denominator is 10. Now, I'm subtracting these fractions. That means it needs to have a common denominator. To find the common denominator, we need to find the least common multiple between the 5 and the 10, the two denominators. I find that the least common multiple between 5 and 10 is 10. So 4 tenths remains the same, but 3 over 5 needs to be multiplied by 2 to get the answer 10. So 5 times 2 is 10. Whatever I do to the denominator, I'll also do to the numerator. So 3 times 2 is 6. Now I can combine these together. I've got 6 minus 4 tenths, which gives me 2 over 10. 2 over 10 is not in a reduced form. I need to see which number goes evenly into both. I see that 2 goes evenly into both of these. 2 goes into 2 one time evenly, and 2 goes into 10 5 times evenly to give me the final answer, 1/5. So 3 fifths minus 0.4 would equal 1/5 in fraction form. All right. Now, I skipped numbers, I didn't go on to the next odd one because the next odd one was another decimal form. I want to do number 8 just to show you how to do it if we were looking for it in decimal form. So let's go on and do number 8. You work out number 9 on your own, but you can use this for help as well. All right, we've got 2 over 5 times 0.12. Now, we're gonna change the 2/5 into a decimal. And I did that over here. So my denominator becomes my divisor and my numerator is my dividend. So I see how many times does 5 go into 2? It does not, so I write a 0 and I place my decimal points and I line them up. And then I add a 0, okay? How many times does 5 go into 20? It goes into it 4 times, so 4 times 5 is 20, then I subtract it. So by doing this, I have converted my fraction into a decimal. And now I can multiply 0.4, which represents this, by 0.12. And I always like putting the smaller number at the bottom, okay? So I put 0.4 at the bottom and 0.12 at the top. Now, if you'll notice, the decimals aren't lined up. They don't need to be lined up when it's multiplication. When you're multiplying decimal numbers together, it's important that you line up the digits, not the decimals. So I lined up my digits, all right? So 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 0 is 0, okay? And now to determine where the decimal goes, I count the decimal places. 1, 2, 3. There's 3 decimal places, so 1, 2, 3. So I place my decimal point there. And a 0 holds the 1st place. All right, that's gonna be it for this video. In the next video, part 2, we're gonna do problems 11, I believe. Problems 11 through 39. Okay, so we're doing all the problems today, Thursday. Don't worry, this is the last day of work for this week. You get Friday off, no work. You don't have to worry about it unless you're behind on work. In that case, you need to get caught up. All right, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you.